The air was thick with tension, as though the very atmosphere was waiting for something to break. In the desolate, war-torn expanse of Sector 9, Outpost Vortex lay in ruins. The last remnants of the once thriving colony now stood as a graveyard to the arrogance of those who thought they could tame this part of the galaxy. For mercenaries like Lucas Graves, this was the kind of place they thrived in, the kind of place that felt like home. He was a veteran killer, hardened by decades of bloodshed and carnage, a man who had survived horrors that would break most. He had fought through space battles, bled across distant moons, and seen entire civilizations brought to their knees. But this was different. The ground trembled beneath his boots, and the feeling in the air shifted from bad to worse. Lucas was the one to get rattled, but even he could feel it. A low hum thrummed through the air, not quite a sound but a presence, like the hum of an approaching storm that had the power to tear worlds apart. He was no stranger to fear. He'd faced it time and time again. But this was something else. The legends were true, and now he was about to meet them face to face. "Graves, you feel that?" came a voice crackling through his comms. It was Mark, a fellow mercenary, and one of the few men Lucas had trusted in this deadly business. The static in his voice was unmistakable, a signal of pure, unadulterated fear. "I feel it," Lucas replied, his voice calm but with an edge of unease. He knew exactly what Mark was talking about. The stories had been whispered among the veteran killers for years, but they were always dismissed as exaggerations. Just bar talk for soldiers who had seen too much. Deathworlders, the apex predators of the galaxy, creatures so deadly that entire fleets had been lost trying to fight them. No one had ever seen one and lived to tell the tale. Until now. "Remember what we were briefed on," Lucas muttered, his grip tightening around his weapon. "Keep your distance. Don't let them get close." It was the only advice that had ever worked against the Deathworlders, if you could even call it advice. The truth was, nobody had ever figured out how to fight them, let alone survive an encounter. "Yeah, easy for you to say. You fought everything in this galaxy, but never anything like this," Mark shot back, the fear creeping into his voice. "What if we're not meant to fight them? What if we're just prey?" Lucas didn't respond immediately. He didn't have an answer, and he wasn't sure there was one. He had spent his entire life hunting down the worst of the worst, criminals, traitors, alien warlords, but this was beyond anything he had ever prepared for. The Deathworlders were not like the others. They were something else entirely, something human minds could barely comprehend. They were born of chaos, engineered for one purpose: to conquer and annihilate. Their bodies were a perfect blend of biology and brutality. Their strength was unmatched, their endurance legendary. They could survive in environments where humans would suffocate or burn. Their senses were so advanced that they could track their prey across entire planets without missing a step. They were the galaxy's apex, and they had come for something or someone. As Lucas and his team moved deeper into the ruins, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by any ordinary enemy, but by something that knew their every move before they even made it. The terrain seemed to shift, the shadows growing deeper, the very air thick with an oppressive weight. The legends about the Deathworlders weren't stories to amuse drunken soldiers. They were warnings that Lucas had ignored for far too long. He had never believed in fate, but now, standing in the heart of that forsaken outpost, it seemed inevitable. No amount of firepower or military strategy would save them. He had faced armies, he had faced monsters, but the stories of the Deathworlders had always seemed too far-fetched. After all, how could a group of killers like him, men and women who had seen everything, be expected to run when the true predators arrived? The ground shook again, this time stronger, and a distant howl cut through the air, primal and savage. It was a sound that no human should ever hear and live to speak of. The hairs on the back of Lucas's neck stood on end, and the whispers of doubt that had been creeping into his mind finally solidified into a terrifying truth. There was no escape. They weren't just facing another enemy. They were facing extinction. In that moment, Lucas's entire perspective shifted. He wasn't just hunting anymore. He was being hunted. And for the first time in his career, a chilling thought crossed his mind. Maybe this time, the predator wouldn't be him. Graves. Mark's voice broke through the static again, louder this time, panic rising in his tone. "They're here. They're real." Lucas didn't need any more confirmation. He had seen the look in Mark's eyes over comms before, when they had walked into the wrong situation, faced an enemy they couldn't touch. He didn't even need to ask. The fear in Mark's voice told him everything. "They're here," Lucas said grimly, his voice hardening into a whisper. "And we're about to find out just how real they are." As the mercenaries moved cautiously through the ruins, every instinct in Lucas screamed at him to turn back. But there was no going back now. The Deathworlders had come, and they weren't leaving until their blood stained the soil. Whatever the cost, Lucas knew one thing for certain. No one, no matter how skilled or prepared, could stand against them and live. They were the galaxy's true predators. And no matter how many kills Lucas had under his belt, he was about to learn that even the best hunters ran when the Deathworlders arrived. The first sign that something was wrong came when the air felt colder, sharper, almost as if the atmosphere itself was rejecting their presence. Lucas had fought on battlefields where the very ground seemed to swallow up the dead and where the smell of burnt flesh lingered long after the fight ended. But this was different. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sensation that wrapped itself around your lungs and squeezed. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as his eyes scanned the wreckage of the outpost, searching for any movement. It wasn't paranoia. It was survival instinct. "Keep your eyes open," Lucas commanded, his voice calm but laced with urgency. His hand instinctively hovered near his sidearm, though he knew it would do little good if what was coming was what they feared. Mark's voice came back through the comms, shaky and breathless. They're not like anything we've fought before. They're everywhere." Mark sounded like he was trying to convince himself as much as Lucas. "I got 2 on my 6. No, make that 3. Shit, I can't see them, but I know they're there." Lucas didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He knew what Mark was going through. In his years of mercenary work, he had faced every kind of threat imaginable, from alien warlords to entire battalions of ruthless soldiers. But the Deathworlders were a different breed entirely. These were not just creatures. They were hunters, precision instruments of death, honed by generations of survival in the most hostile environments imaginable. When Lucas had first heard the rumors about the Deathworlders, he had dismissed them as tall tales. There was no way such a creature existed. A race of predators so deadly that they could wipe out whole colonies without breaking a sweat. It sounded like the kind of story that drunk soldiers share around a campfire. But now, standing in the ruins of the outpost, Lucas knew better. These were no myths. The Deathworlders were real, and they were relentless. The first Deathworlder appeared without warning. A massive shape darted from the shadows, so fast that Lucas barely had time to react. It was a blur of muscle, claws, and sheer animalistic fury. The creature's body was a grotesque combination of natural and engineered traits. Its skin a patchwork of thick armor and sinew, covered in dark, chitinous plates that reflected the faint light of the dying sun. Its eyes, black and soulless, glowed with an eerie intelligence that sent a chill down Lucas's spine. The Deathworlder's mouth opened, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth that gleamed in the dim light. Before anyone could get a shot off, the creature lunged, closing the distance in the blink of an eye. Mark screamed in terror as he tried to raise his weapon, but it was already too late. The creature's claws dug into his armor, sending sparks flying as it ripped through his defenses like tissue paper. A second later, Mark was gone, his body thrown aside like a rag doll. The creature didn't pause. It was already hunting again, its movement swift and lethal. "Mark, no!" Lucas shouted, his voice breaking through the chaos. But it was already over. The team was down to just a handful of survivors. The Deathworlder had taken its prize, and now it was back on the hunt. "Pull back. Now!" Lucas ordered, his voice hardening as he dropped to one knee. Scanning the area for more movement, they had no choice but to retreat. There was no fighting this thing head-on, not unless they wanted to end up like Mark. As they scrambled for cover, the Deathworlder's eerie growl echoed to the ruined outpost, reverberating off the shattered walls. The sound sent a shiver through the remaining mercenaries, freezing them in their tracks for just a moment. Lucas didn't hesitate. He grabbed a fellow soldier by the arm and pulled him into cover behind a broken pillar. The mercenary was shaking, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "This is bad," the soldier muttered, his voice hoarse. I've heard stories about them, but I didn't think they were real." "They're real," Lucas snapped, keeping his eyes trained on the shadows. "And they don't care about your stories. They're here to kill." The thing about Deathworlders wasn't just their sheer physical power. It was their minds. They were predators, not just in body, but in intellect. Their hunting strategies were flawless, designed to exploit every weakness. They didn't just kill, they hunted for sport, for dominance. And now, they had their eyes on humanity. As Lucas led the remaining mercenaries through the ruins, he knew that their only hope was to outsmart these creatures. Firepower alone wouldn't save them. It never had in the past, not when facing something so fundamentally different from anything they had encountered. The Deathworlders were a force of nature, and nature, as always, was utterly indifferent to human life. But Lucas had seen things that others couldn't even begin to imagine. He had survived battles against overwhelming odds, had faced death countless times, and had come out on top. If anyone could figure out how to fight back, it was him. But the clock was ticking, and the more they moved through the ruined outpost, the more it felt like they were being herded. There was no escape. They were surrounded, and the Deathworlders were closing in. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook again, this time harder, and the distant sound of deep, guttural roar echoed through the air. Lucas's stomach dropped. It wasn't just one Deathworlder. It was a whole pack, and they were closing in fast. "There's no way we're outrunning this," one of the mercenaries said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to fight. We need to—" "Shut up," Lucas interrupted, cutting him off. "We fight and we die. If we run, we might survive." He turned to face the remaining group. "We make it to the extraction point. We run. No matter what, we don't stop." It wasn't a plan. It was a last-ditch hope. But it was all they had. With their weapons at the ready and their nerves steeled, the mercenaries began to move again, keeping their eyes peeled for any sign of the Deathworlders. Every step felt like it could be their last. The creatures were out there, and they were patient. They were waiting for the right moment to strike. And Lucas knew that when that moment came, there would be no room for mistakes. In the silence that followed, the question lingered in the air. What could humanity do against an enemy so perfect, so relentless, that even the galaxy's most skilled killers feared them? The answer was simple. Nothing. At least not alone. And as Lucas's team pressed on, they realized with cold certainty that they weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their place in a galaxy that had just become far more dangerous than any of them had ever imagined. The crackling static of the comms filled the air as the mercenaries trudged through the darkened ruins, every footstep feeling heavier than the last. The feeling of being hunted had escalated from a nagging suspicion to an undeniable certainty. They weren't just dealing with a single Deathworlder. They were facing an entire pack, a coordinated force of predators who understood the art of hunting like no other species in the galaxy. The more Lucas moved, the more it became clear that no strategy, no amount of experience, could prepare them for this. In the cold, desolate corridors of the outpost, their chances of survival had dwindled to nearly nothing. But as grim as the situation was, Lucas couldn't afford to show weakness. He had led mercenaries through worse before, but this was unlike anything he had encountered. The air was thick with the scent of danger, and each breath felt like it might be their last. The pack of Deathworlders wasn't just moving. They were hunting with deliberate intent. Their strategies were sophisticated, hunting in ways that Lucas could only describe as intelligent, even tactical. He motioned for the team to halt, his hand raised in a silent signal for everyone to take cover. They were nearing the edge of the outpost, where the wreckage of a once functional communication tower stood tall, its crumpled skeleton reaching into the stormy sky. In the distance, the faint sound of movement echoed to the broken walls, but there was no sign of the Deathworlders yet. It didn't matter. They were out there, lurking the shadows. "Keep your heads down," Lucas murmured. "If they know we're here, they'll wait until we make a mistake. Don't give them that chance." They all nodded, their faces pale but determined. The group was down to 5 now, with Markon and the others too shaken to speak much. The fight had left them physically drained, emotionally spent, but Lucas knew there was no time for doubt. They needed to keep moving, to push forward, or they'd be slaughtered where they stood. One of the mercenaries, a younger soldier by the name of Ellis, was visibly struggling to hold it together. His hands shook as he clutched his rifle, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chilling air. He had never been in a situation like this, and it showed. Lucas understood. Fear was a natural response in the face of something this deadly, but it couldn't be allowed to rule them. Ellis, get together. Lucas said quietly, meeting his gaze. We move as one. Stick to the plan. Ellis swallowed hard but nodded, trying to compose himself. Lucas didn't blame him. No one was prepared for a fight like this. The Deathworlders weren't just physically superior. They were hunters by nature, which meant they could anticipate every move, every tactic. They had been bred to win. And right now, it felt as though they were already playing the Deathworlders game. The silence dragged on, thick and suffocating. But Lucas wasn't fooled. He had seen enough battles to recognize the signs. The Deathworlders were closing in, surrounding them from all sides. There was no escape. They had to fight, or they had to run. Lucas knew which option was the most likely to result in survival, but he also knew that running wasn't a guarantee. The Deathworlders didn't just hunt for food, they hunted for sport. To them, this was a game, and they were playing it to perfection. Finally, the silence was shattered by a low growl, a sound so primal, so ancient, that it sent a jolt of terror through the entire group. The noise came from above them, a deep, rumbling growl that vibrated in their bones. Lucas's head snapped up just in time to see a massive Deathworlder leap down from the rafters of the tower, its claws glinting in the dim light as it landed with a thud that sent dust and debris into the air. The mercenaries scattered, immediately opening fire, but the creature was too fast. It dodged and weaved through the incoming blasts, its movements fluid and almost predatory. It was like fighting a shadow, a blur of motion too quick to track. The mercenary shots barely missed, and the sound of gunfire echoed through the ruins, mingling with the creature's howls of anger. Focus fire. Lucas barked, his own weapon already aimed at the Deathworlder's head. But before he could pull the trigger, the creature closed the gap, its massive claws slashing through the air like knives. A mercenary to his left cried out in pain as one of the claws raked across his chest, tearing through his armor with ease. He fell to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Damn it! Lucas growled, rage and fear surging through him in equal measure. He fired, hitting the Deathworld in the shoulder, but it barely slowed down. Instead, it let out a high-pitched screech that rattled their bones. That was when the others came, a second Deathworlder, then a third, all emerging from the shadows like ghosts. They were surrounded. There was no safe corner left to hide in. Retreat! Lucas shouted, his voice sharp with authority. Fall back to the extraction point. Now! But the Deathworlders were too fast. They were already moving in for the kill, not in a frenzy, but with methodical precision. The mercenaries tried to break formation, but it was no use. Lucas saw Ellis trip and fall, and by the time he tried to help him up, one of the creatures was upon them. The mercenary didn't even have time to scream. The Deathworlder's claws ripped into him, and his body was thrown aside like a rag doll. The others continued to fight, firing wildly, but it was clear that they were outmatched. The realization hit Lucas like a physical blow. They were all going to die. It wasn't a question of how or when. It was a certainty. The Deathworlders had them outgunned, outmoved and outlasted. There was no escaping this. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, Lucas couldn't give up. He was a killer, a survivor. His entire life had been spent in the midst of death and destruction. But this was something different. The Deathworlders were like an unstoppable force of nature. But Lucas had learned long ago that no force was unbeatable. It was just a matter of understanding how to fight it, how to adapt. As the remaining survivors fought on, Lucas knew this was it, the final battle. There would be no retreat, no hope of reinforcements, only the will to survive, if only for a few more moments. The Deathworlders had come, and they would see humanity's strength or die trying. The mercenaries were down to their last legs. Every instinct Lucas had honed through years of warfare screamed for him to keep fighting, to keep pushing back against the inevitable. But even he couldn't deny the overwhelming truth that hung heavy in the air. They were outmatched, outclassed, and surrounded. The Deathworlders had them in a tightening noose, and the last few soldiers, bloodied and broken, were running on nothing but sheer willpower. Hope, as far as Lucas could see, had long since abandoned them. Through the haze of gunfire and shouts, Lucas's mind raced. They needed a miracle. No one could survive a battle like this, not against creatures so ferocious, so well adapted to slaughter that the very concept of fear seemed foreign to them. Even Lucas, who had walked the fires of hell more times than he cared to count, felt a cold weight of fear settle into his bones. But that wasn't something he could afford to show. Not now. Not ever. A screech from one of the Deathworlders split the air, and in that moment, Lucas realized just how precise their hunt was. They weren't simply attacking. No, they were playing with them. They were toying with the mercenaries, savoring each kill, each moment of desperation. Lucas had never fought an enemy that took such pleasure in inflicting terror, and that realization made the situation even more horrifying. Death was inevitable, but the Deathworlders didn't just want to kill. They wanted to break their spirits, to destroy their very will to fight. Lucas's gaze flickered to the extraction point, barely visible in the distance through the smoke and dust. It was a faint hope, one that seemed more impossible with every passing second. The Deathworlders were closing in, methodically sweeping through the wreckage of the outpost, ensuring no one escaped alive. The few mercenaries left were firing desperately, but it was clear they had little ammunition left, and their bodies were barely holding up against a relentless assault. A sharp pain erupted in Lucas's side as a clawed foot connected with his abdomen, throwing him backward. His vision blurred as he landed hard against the debris. The breath knocked out of him. Blood dripped from a wound, but Lucas didn't have time to process the injury. He rolled to his feet, his hand on his side, and stumbled toward the nearest cover. He had to keep moving. There was no time to feel the pain. "Graves!" shouted Ellis, his voice faint with fear. We can't. I know." Lucas cut him off, his voice low but filled with quiet resolve. "But we keep moving, keep fighting." Ellis was breathing heavily, his rifle trembling in his hands. But there was no retreat. There was no other choice now but to survive for as long as possible, to give everything they had left. The Deathworlders would never stop. They wouldn't rest until every human had been eradicated, until the very memory of humanity had been wiped from existence. But Lucas wasn't going to let that happen, not on his watch. Even if the fight was hopeless, even if they were all doomed to die here, he wasn't going down without making them earn it. He rose to his feet, pushing through the pain in his side, and motioned for Ellis to follow him. They made their way toward the remnants of the tower, the last bit of high ground that might offer them a brief respite. But as they moved, the ground trembled beneath them once again. Lucas barely had time to react before one of the Deathworlders appeared from the shadows, a hulking figure towering over them with eyes that burned with predatory intelligence. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it advanced slowly, methodically, like a hunter savoring the moment before the kill. Lucas fired. The blast struck the Deathworlder's chest, but it didn't even flinch. It was like shooting at a mountain. The creature let out a deep, rumbling growl and lunged forward, its claws extending like blades of death. "Move!" Lucas shouted as he grabbed Ellis by the arm, pulling him back as the creature's claws slashed through the air. They barely managed to evade the strike, but it was clear that their options were running out. Another Deathworlder appeared, this one even larger than the first, its dark eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. Lucas knew that if they didn't make it to the extraction point in the next few minutes, they were finished. But the more they fought, the more they realized just how hopeless the situation truly was. The Deathworlders weren't just out for blood. They were playing a long game, systematically draining the survivors until there was nothing left. "Graves!" Ellis screamed again, panic rising in his voice. "We can't outrun them. We can't keep fighting them like this." Lucas paused, his gaze hardening as he stared down the approaching Deathworlders. There was a sickening finality in his thoughts. He had lived his life as a killer, as a survivor, but this This was something entirely beyond human comprehension. The Deathworlders weren't just predators. They were an unstoppable force, and humanity had no place in their galaxy. And yet, as Lucas looked at the few survivors still fighting, still trying to hold on to their last shred of hope, something inside him shifted. This wasn't just about surviving. It was about proving that humanity wasn't just fodder for the galaxy's deadliest species. This was about showing the Deathworlders that no matter how overwhelming their superiority, no matter how much they enjoyed the kill, humanity wouldn't just lay down and die. "We may not win this," Lucas muttered under his breath, "but we're not going down without showing them why they should be afraid of us." The last moments were a blur of motion and pain. The sound of gunfire, the screeches of the Deathworlders, the cries of the remaining mercenaries, they all blended together in cacophony of hopelessness. But amidst the chaos, Lucas kept his focus. He kept his mind sharp, pushing forward, determined to give his team one last chance at survival. But deep down, Lucas knew the Deathworlders had won. There was no escape. There was no hope of victory. All that was left now was to make sure that the creatures understood one thing. Humanity might not have been the most powerful species in the galaxy, but they were a species that would fight to the bitter end. And in the end, maybe that was the only victory that mattered.